Stanford University.
Please welcome our guest, Reilly Brennan. Reilly is a founding partner, a general partner at Trucks VC, a seed stage venture capital fund for entrepreneurs changing the future of transportation. Trucks, Reilly has invested in transformational mobility companies such as Autonomy, Now Emotional, Cruise, Joby Aviation, and actually many more. Prior to Trucks, Reilly was executive director for Stanford's automotive research program, and still when in-person participation allows, also teaches a class. And he was a member of the Le Mans winning factory Corvette C5R program. Thank you very much for joining us to talk about this really hot space.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. Thanks, everybody, for having me. I really appreciate being here with everybody. Obviously, I love Stanford, primarily because I didn't get into Stanford as a high school student. And so being able to come back and teach at Stanford is just one of life's great pleasures.
Yeah, I probably wouldn't have gotten any as a high school student. I think we share that. But yeah, thank you for the contributions you have made or still making to the Stanford community.
Stanford, just as an aside, I really started life as a car guy, like with posters of race cars on my wall. And it was when I got to Stanford about a decade ago that I started to have my eyes open to transportation and other ideas beyond just the car. And my fund is really the genesis of my fund, which we can talk about, was hanging around Stanford and seeing that there were a lot of founders working on things that the car industry wasn't working on. And that's the whole reason I have a fund today. So Stanford played a huge part in that.
Okay, you totally read my mind in terms of first question. So I was going to ask you like did you always know you wanted to get into this space? But yeah, so you answered that. I wanted to start with a small anecdote. I read on one of the Stanford web pages that your land speed record is 168 miles per hour. Driving, presumably, yeah. And I have to admit that I chickened out at 146 miles per hour in my father's A8 on the Autobahn in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought, okay, that's fast enough. Yeah, where did you drive 168? Was that in Le Mans? And how was it?
That was at a decommissioned Air Force base in the lower peninsula of Michigan. So there's a great old air base called Oscoda, and it's used for race car testing, shakedown tests, and things like that. And in a former life, when I was a lot younger, I was a journalist and I reviewed cars. So actually, when I was an undergrad at University of Michigan, my job was to test drive cars. It was really fun. And a little bit after that, I was running this media organization, and I had the opportunity to drive a Can-Am car, which for anybody who's followed racing is like the most extreme, no rules racing from the 60s and 70s. And this one particular car I really loved called the Chaparral. I got to drive this one car at this track, and I didn't bend the car and I didn't hurt myself. So I've considered a mission accomplished. Because I'm not a race car driver, I'm just an enthusiast that got an opportunity and wants to do that. So yeah, it was really fun. And it also proved to me like the differences between those who are really good at doing something like that and an interloper like myself. There's a huge amount of daylight, right? So the people who actually go out and almost like the way you think about an experimental aircraft pilot is so different from somebody flying a drone in their backyard. That's what I'm like.
Yeah, I start with that because I wanted to start our discussion with talking about your vision for transportation and mobility. But first, maybe explain how you see the difference between transportation and mobility. It seems like these terms are thrown around almost interchangeably, which was a bit of a surprise as I dug into this. As a civil engineer, I focus on stuff that doesn't move. So we'll come back to that later. But maybe before we get to the vision, how do you differentiate between transportation and mobility?
That's a great question, Martin. And I like to use the term transportation and not mobility. Mm-hmm. And I think it's because in the last 5 years, there have been a lot of people that have come in and just looked at different business models, and a lot of, maybe not so much over the last year, but 2 and 3 years ago, every idea in mobility, every idea that was mobility related seemed to be shared use, like business models and although that stuff was interesting, I didn't think it really encompassed all the wide variety of things you could do in this space, which not scientifically, I think transportation is a better word for that. And it's also, by the way, the reason why I think transportation is a great place to invest money or spend your time, because at any one time, the market can be up in one part of transportation and down in another. And this is particularly true of things like if you follow new car sales, they might be down. And when that happens, used car sales are up and service and maintenance businesses go up in value. And I've always loved that part about transportation, which I don't think is well captured with just the term mobility. So it's not that I hate the term mobility. I just try to use the term transportation more.
No, actually, no, it makes sense to me because transportation is broader. Mobility seems to focus on people, and transportation is really, you could imagine lots of things there.
Yeah.
But so how do you foresee the future? Are we going to zip around in 100, all well coordinated at 168 miles per hour? I've heard other visions that focus on zero accidents or affordability, a dramatic improvement in affordability. I could see reliability, quality of experience, transparency. I could see many aspects of that vision. What are sort of some hallmarks for how we will experience transportation in the future? Or maybe if you prefer to share some vivid examples of how our lives might be affected or different, better in 5-10 years.
Yeah. At the core, I think this decade is going to be defined by zero emission transportation. So it's what a wonderful place to spend your time if you're a researcher or you're an entrepreneur. And I think of transportation as one of these. I remember my chemistry teacher in high school used to say, what in the world isn't chemistry? And to some extent, when you get into the modern world, what isn't impacted by transportation? And you can, if you think about companies in this space, they need policy people and business people and designers. And there's just so much that transportation touches. I know I sound like a bit of a cheerleader for this category, but I do think it's just worthwhile to think of it like that. And so for us, we're always interested in, we have these 3 goals for our investments. They should make transportation safer, cleaner, and more accessible. And for me, the accessibility piece is really what technology tends to do pretty well, which is that ideas generally start looking a little bit strange. Sometimes it might be a little expensive, and eventually they're actually brought into really low cost. And in transportation, unfortunately, I think we have to face the fact that a lot of the things that we've made cheap, like parking and credit, have also created a lot of other geometry problems and health problems for us. So what are the ways that we can enable zero emission, low cost, simple transportation options? And the reality of it is a lot of great technology would have probably been better served in a city just by putting in bike lanes. So this is one of the fascinating parts of being in transportation, is that everybody has a different opinion about the right way to, I think of it, everybody's got a different recipe for making cookies. And when you think about how people were to, if you were to plan out transportation and how a city should be using all these resources, it's similar that you have some people who have a strong dogma that you need this much amount of flour and sugar. And I think that the balance in the United States has clearly been designed around automobiles, and we have created a lot of freedom, but we've also created a lot of problems. And so that's what's wonderful about some of these new things we've seen, is that transportation is a great leverage to do better things, particularly with cities.
Yeah, there's actually a couple of threads I want to pick up on. One is the accessibility in particular, and one is on diversity, and the other one on the different types of cities you find in the world, and maybe pick up there, and to what extent does international potential, I know you focus the funds of mostly in North America, but to what extent does international potential drive your decisions, and to what extent have you seen international influences in the ideas that get pitched to you? I'm just reflecting on an experience in Copenhagen a few years ago, on very dark January morning, and my hotel was in a side street, and I thought, I have plenty of time, just a short taxi right away. What I had not factored in is that it would take us literally 10 minutes to get out of the side street onto the main street, because there was an uninterrupted flow of bicycles. And this was a blizzard happening. It was dark. The wind was blowing. Snow was falling. And we had to literally wait 10 minutes until there was a gap in the bicycles. Right? You would think this should happen in Palo Alto, but no, that's that in Copenhagen. I thought, okay, this is a different attitude. And then I researched in half of the professional commute, regardless of whatever happens with bicycles there. Anyway, so very different experiences around the world, obviously, and I'm sure many other cities we could mention. So to what extent does this international potential and also ideas that come from elsewhere? I guess it's two questions. How much do you see international ideas influence or international experience shape ideas, and to what extent is potential for globalization of some of your technologies a driver in your investment decision?
I would say that my own personal sort of travels, which unfortunately I haven't done much of, recently, have influenced it a lot. And I think that some of the things we see in some other cities, you mentioned Copenhagen is a perfect example. I think a lot of young people wish my city looked a lot more like that. And I think of it like the Halloween candy test. Would you allow your kids to safely traipse through your neighborhood without having to hold their hand the whole time? And is the geometry of your city such that you'd feel comfortable with your 8-year-old going for a bike ride? And if the answer to that is no, you've got to really ask some serious questions about how we're allocating space. From a truck's perspective, I think one of the things that I'm really interested in is like new global EV brands. Like I think that to assume that Tesla is kind of the only EV brand is really short selling the future. And so Rivian would be maybe another example, but in the light electric vehicle category for bicycles, I think there'll be some amazing brands created this decade. And some of them might be in, like, for example, I think when India goes electrified, it will be a 2 and 3 wheel product, not a 4-wheeled Tesla that changes India to electrification. And also, I think if you take a look at a brand like Van Moof, which is a Dutch e-bike brand, it's quite early days, but it's not hard for me to imagine how Van Moof 5 or 10 years from now is actually a really dominant global e-bike light electric vehicle brand. So I'm really fascinated by that. And because of the way that some of these vehicles can be built and some of the supply chain, which is already global in some way, I actually think we're going to see new brands start from seedlings as opposed to big companies like GM or Nissan start building exceptional bikes and small vehicles.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the other aspect, but I was frankly a little bit stunned. I don't know what you students thought the reading we did and what we read as background for the class. But a reflection I had about the reading, how it seemed one size fits all kind of approach. At least I felt there should have been much more consideration of diversity for different age groups, for different people with different abilities, and so forth. So I was a little stunned by that.
What was the reading?
By the lack of that, there's a couple readings from Sidewalk Labs and one from Lyft. We'll come to that, predicting we'll have lots of autonomous Lyft vehicles this year. And then one from McKinsey on sort of smart city.
Okay.
And I was, because I really loved seeing your statement about we'll never speak on a panel. For those that didn't see that statement, a panel that has only men on it. And here are a couple hundred women that are doing great things in the space. So don't come with the excuse we can't find somebody. And so that made me think about the diversity. And I was wondering, to what extent is that a factor when you choose an investment? Do you get it pitched a lot? Is that on the horizon at all, or is it not yet on the horizon but should be? Yeah.
So just to set the stage, I don't think that 4 and 5 people discussions are actually that valuable to me personally anyway. And one of the things that I've realized about it is I feel that way probably because I've been over invited to things. And when we really did like an audit of this is going back 4 or 5 years ago, the sort of typical auto show or innovation panel, it was usually just white men from the auto industry talking about the auto industry. And one of the things we came up with as a fund was, why don't we just tell these people who are organizing these events, I'll do it, but if you also have a woman on stage, this is what we call the inverse of the Mike Pence rule, who famously wouldn't participate wouldn't go to dinner with one other woman or something like that. We would say that, and then people would say to us, that's fine, but I don't know any women in the auto industry. Like, they would literally say that. And so we got so frustrated from hearing that, we were like, well, I guess we have to create a database of great women in transportation, because it would shut that argument up quickly. So we did that. If you go to women.trucks.vc, there's a couple hundred amazing executives there and categorized. Therefore, we can give them that resource. And I always give up my spot if there's a 4-person panel and there's not a woman on it. So that's just like a company-wide policy we have. And in the auto industry particularly, there's a really incredible disparity between, if you look at the executives, most of these teams, other than the exceptions you have, Mary Barra and stuff like that, most of the old school Detroit and European auto industries are run by white men. And then in venture, I would say that the numbers are a little bit better, but that's not saying much, because the auto industry is so awful with the diversity numbers they have. So our portfolio is indicative of probably just startups in general, which are a little bit more diverse. What we have as rule at Trucks is, we say if there's a diverse founder, we'll let them move through the first gate in our process, so that we make sure we do a call with them. Because one of the things at Trucks is we do a qualification step before we talk to founders. And the qualification step is really just to simplify our funnel. And it's like, hey, are they raising the right amount of money? Is it still a seed round? Is there enough of the seed round available for us to invest? And it's actually a pretty hard filter, because it cuts out at least half of the companies we see. If there's a founder from that team who basically checks one of the boxes for diversity and inclusion on our side, then we'll do a first call with them anyway, just because we feel like it's our job to make the numbers in this whole like automotive world a lot better. And since we have such an important part of it, which is that we're funding companies, it's important for us to do that. And we have a lot of diverse founders. About a third of our portfolio has a woman or a person of color as a leader in the company, usually a C-level and a founder.
I think that's pretty cool.
It's actually just weird that nobody else in the auto space does stuff like this. It should be relatively normal, and I'm not saying it like to put any other people down. It's just one of those like obvious things, like saying thank you when somebody opens the door for you or something like that, where you're like, that's kind of that should be pretty normal. So we have a small part to play. We fund about 8 companies a year. And I wish my other colleagues from the other automotive venture capital funds would do the same.
Yeah, still over the years, you have quite a portfolio. I have to admit, I didn't manage to look through every one of the companies you invested in or currently invested. But I'm curious, what breakthroughs are you most excited to get us towards this zero emission and more accessible vision?
Sure. For the first time, we've made energy investments in the last year. And we usually just, to be honest, Martin, usually our investments were if it moved the vehicle itself, like a lot of autonomy investments, sensors, maybe things related to risk and driver monitoring. But a lot of it was stuff you would expect on a automated vehicle. And for the first time this year, we did, over the last 12 months, we've done stuff which is just really touching the energy side of it. So we did a low-cost silicon anode. We just did our first hydrogen investment, which is a hydrogen storage and distribution system. Would remind you of Nespresso or Keurig, in the sense that the IP is in the container to move hydrogen, as opposed to, it's not a hydrogen generation station or something like that. So I think one of the challenging parts, to answer your question, is there are probably going to be different types of energy you need for different applications, and far it's going to be really expensive. So if you're, let's say you're Ford Motor Company or you're Daimler, maybe Daimler is a better example, because Daimler sells really small cars. They sell delivery vans. They sell big trucks in the way of Freightliner they own. And they have to have powertrains, which at least 3 different types of powertrains across that whole spectrum. So they probably will need a range of battery electric vehicles. They probably need a range of hybrids in the truck category, still running diesel. Eventually, they need to run hydrogen or something in long haul trucking. And that's just really expensive to do that type of powertrain development. Mm-hmm. So that's, to me, this decade will be defined by that. It will also crumble a few companies. I'm not saying that Daimler is going to crumble because of this task, but it's going to be a Herculean effort if you're one of these kind of full line companies to address all these powertrain energy problems or opportunities. One is how these different energy ideas will impact different segments in transportation. And I think that aviation is going to go the same way, that we'll have VTOLs that are short distance, that are electric, and then eventually probably using some hydrogen there as well. So I think that's, for me, that's going to be amazing to watch over the next decade. The other thing, which I think is really important, is just the idea that we can make great lightweight urban vehicles with a fun sense of vehicle dynamics. So one of my passions growing up as a kid was, could I get the chance to drive that Chaparral race car? And the folly of a lot of these like sports cars is you need a lot of money and you need a ton of room to run them. So the opportunity for somebody to go out and actually have fun in one of these cars, like, you have to go either at a racetrack or you need to break the law in order to experience what it's been designed to do. Mm-hmm. And I think the other really interesting opportunity is, can you have, given congestion in cities, can you have really great vehicle dynamics experiences in smaller vehicles? It's actually a really hard engineering challenge for, if we were at Porsche and we wanted to create a small one-seater vehicle for cities, but I think that would be a really cool exercise. Right now, you can do a really interesting version of that in a bicycle. But what are those interesting small vehicle experiences where you don't have to go 180 miles an hour? You could be going 18 miles an hour, mm-hmm. and you feel something magical. And I'm really excited about that, which is both it's an electric vehicle problem, it's a mechanical engineering problem. So those are 2.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Looking at some of your companies, I've opened really my eyes to the sort of many facets of transportation, and then just how many advancements are being made and still need to be made. And I was wondering how many of those have to come together to create really a significant change that we will notice. Is there a lot of synergy? Yes, I could see there are synergies, but what are some synergies that you're particularly excited about, or maybe even worried about whether they will happen?
Yeah.
I guess. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
No, one way to think about this is some of the most impactful companies in transportation didn't need anybody else's permission, right? Waze and Uber mm-hmm. didn't need Daimler to say yes to something for them to have a great company. Mm-hmm. No, that's pretty cool. And so there are totally disruptive ideas which are completely outside of the supply chain that people will come up with over the next decade. And I hope we fund those companies at Trucks. Then there's like these new ecosystems where I'm only starting to understand the different layers of value. So a good example of that would be charging. And like, I thought I knew a lot about charging until 3 months ago. And then I've realized all the different energy tariffs and service contracts required to keep a charger in great uptime, and all the stupid reasons why a charger goes out of service. And I've learned a lot about the service layer on EV chargers. And I think that there's a billion-dollar company in just that part about it within the United States, because of all the chargers we're going to have to put in and what's required. So I kind of love I guess this is one of the best parts about being an investor, is that you get to learn all these new sort of pockets of creation. And then some of them you make a bet on that you believe are going to be really valuable. That is a good example, I think, of we have a couple of different charging and battery related investments. They don't all really need to talk to one another.
Yeah.
Sometimes, like to bring up the example of a McKinsey deck, like now when I receive like a Morgan Stanley paper on charging, I usually send it to a few of our portfolio founders who are in the battery or electrification space. And that list is just like growing like more and more. And what's cool is that some of them talk to one another, even though they're not really related. One of them is doing EV charging as like data science to plan where you put a charger. Another one is service. Another one is doing batteries. So another one's battery management. So they're not really talking to one another, but they're all in that same ecosystem. They benefit from all the consumer push and the policy push to move to electric vehicles. So some of it is like nicely intertwined and some of it isn't.
No, makes sense to me. As a civil engineer, I have to, we don't get so excited when our stuff moves, and you get excited when your things move and we don't, and vice versa. But I'm wondering how you see the relationship between autonomous vehicles and the physical infrastructure. Is it seen as just almost an enemy or something that just has to be dealt with is there? Or is it increasingly seen as a partner or potential partner in enabling new kinds of transportation? And do you see still mostly ideas pitched to you that focus on the stuff that moves, or do you see ideas that connect with the physical infrastructure? I see, for example, Cord strikes me as one of your investments, strikes me has a pretty clear connection to the physical infrastructure. Yeah, where do you see that relationship? How do you see that relationship, and how do you see that continuing or growing or changing in the future between the physical infrastructure and the transportation side?
So we tend to we call it structured autonomy, meaning you can run the same thing over and over again, preferably in a very well-defined area. Sometimes if you go into agriculture or construction, you do so without any passengers, and you do so on private roads at low speed. So I think agriculture automation is probably one of the most perfect reasons that autonomy exists today. And you could go into mining or construction and make similar arguments. But so I think in the near term, some of these ideas that people have been talking about for road vehicles are probably going to be better realized in those environments. But when it comes to infrastructure, I love structured autonomy companies that use the same route, because you can get better at an intersection. You can hang your own sensor on a gantry or on a bollard or something like that. And so like a good example would be May Mobility or Refraction. These are two companies doing city urban AV work. In May's case, they're doing a shuttle. In Refraction, it's a small delivery robot. And in both those companies' cases, they're actually putting something in the infrastructure to make the job of the autonomy system better. And you can only do that if you're doing a structured autonomy business model. If you're just in this open world of any point B out there that the user tells you, you really can't get to those. And so we love using the infrastructure when we can. And then Cord it's an interesting company because they're trying to create this software layer between the curb and some user, whether it's a UPS truck or pickup for a restaurant, if you want to do a 90-second curb space block so that you can pick up your food and things like that. And so that company's point of view would be, think of every curb out there as a revenue opportunity for cities, not just this fixed parking asset that might go fallow in the middle of the night. Yeah, I think it's one of the interesting parts about this space is these different business models can allow you to use the infrastructure. And I think probably most famously, the micromobility companies have had so many infrastructure problems because scooters get, left in the wrong area, or they get penalized by the city because they actually can't manage where the things are quite effectively. So it's a huge part of this.
Yeah. So I do have to talk about the predictions people make, and I have made plenty of. The predictions were right. The time frame was totally wrong. And that was, I would say, the same in this article from Lyft that predicted in 2021 we'll have many autonomous vehicles in the Lyft system. We still have a few months to go, but I'm not sure. But very little car ownership by 2025, that the physical environment will change, which strikes me well. We're not Shanghai in most places. Things take a while. As I talk with people in planning departments in cities, they have not only transportation worries, they have utility worries. They need to think about resilience, sea level rise. What does that do? So the transportation infrastructure is not necessarily the forefront. So I found that article a little bit too self-serving. But anyway, I'm curious where do you make predictions about what will happen in 5-10 years? And I'm totally fine. I get it if you don't. I stopped doing that in my field. And but how is this mix of challenges just from cities, right? That there are many things they have to manage, creating problems or synergies for you.
Mm-hmm. I guess I'm pessimistic on the AV timeline because other than these highly structured environments like ag and mining and maybe some limited applications in urban centers, I'm not one of those people that would tell you that we're going to have a lot of autonomous vehicles soon. Mm-hmm. I think it's actually more like around 15 to 20 years away, that the 2021 thing that Lyft talks about, in my mind, smells like 2035 and 2040. Mm-hmm. And that's equally as unscientific. It just, I know where we are in engineering development, and we're not going to be there by the end of the year at scale. But other predictions, I would say we will get better at managing the human and machine interaction. I think one of the maybe underreported challenges of this decade is how humans get along with machines which have increasing amount of intelligence. And where this usually ends up is people fall asleep or they don't pay attention and they crash into the back of a fire truck or something like that because they thought that their vehicle was going to be better than it really was. And this is, I think, one of the actually bigger problems for the near term is how do you demand that systems like this have an understanding of what the driver is doing? And if the driver isn't paying attention or isn't awake or, is in the back, like playing video games, can you really bring them back, or can you change the system somehow? So those ideas, I think, are actually really interesting to see play out over the next decade. And in commercial vehicles, with the way that insurance is priced, I actually think a pretty reliable prediction would be by the end of this decade, you really won't be able to run a commercial vehicle without some sort of driver monitoring handshake, just for the purposes of pricing that risk. And how that impacts the passenger car market, I think I would like for us to get to something like that, but we also have such a John Wayne-like idea of ourselves in the United States that I don't know if passenger cars will ever get to something as quote unquote big brother as that, even though it might actually save lives.
Yeah. This reminds me, what do you see as some of the biggest barriers? Is it this mindset could be one of them, regulations, just the long-term need for capital? What are, in your experience, the biggest barriers for the advancements in transportation that you mentioned?
One of the things that a lot of these cities need right now, companies aren't really incentivized for. So what I mean by that is the way to make money in the car business is by selling trucks and utilities, particularly in the United States. So the things we talked about at the beginning of our discussion, cities need better bike lanes and better sidewalks and smaller vehicles that don't cost a lot of money. It's actually just totally opposite from the way that where the profit centers are in the automobile business. And so that's why I think it's interesting to study the small electric vehicle makers, because they're actually starting to peek through the canopy and find that there are really great consumer experiences that might have potentially good margin associated with them that could be new leaders. So the limitations, I think, are the dominant players in the United States, at least, are not necessarily incentivized for better, smaller vehicles. They're actually incentivized for the things that we're used to, which is to say there's about 8 parking spots for every car, and there's cheap parking everywhere, and there's cheap financing. So why not just get the bigger SUV the next time you buy a car? And that's great for the profits of those companies. It doesn't necessarily answer the question of how it makes transportation safer for a lot of people in cities or suburbs.
Yeah, that's interestingly actually very similar incentives around buildings, actually, I have to say.
Mm-hmm.
It's now surprising, or not totally surprising, but interesting for me to hear that. So we should go to some questions that the students have asked.
Yeah, sure.
So the top ranked question is, which companies do you think will capture the most value as a result of the widespread rollout of autonomous vehicles? Will it be the incumbent car makers, electric vehicle companies like Tesla, tech giants like Google and Apple, platforms like Uber and Lyft, or totally new startups?
Mm-hmm. I'm going to answer it as if they're like really at scale. I don't think you mean like next year, but like if autonomy is delivered to vehicles like people have been talking about, who will capture the most margin? That's your question. And my take on this is actually it's probably going to be something that's integrated into the building of the vehicle. So I know that in the 3 or 4 years ago, there was this argument of, oh, this is the airline industry and Uber and Lyft will essentially be the airline. And it doesn't really matter what kind of car they have. If it's a Boeing or if it's an Airbus, you don't really ask that question before you get on a plane. And I actually think that's not true for vehicles. If I get out of the airport and I'm with my kids and I have a decision to make, do I get in like a nameless, faceless automobile or do I get in a Toyota? I think it's like there's no question I get in a Toyota. If so much of the vehicle control is designed from these companies. Now, if Uber and Lyft actually do make autonomous vehicles, and if you watch what happened with Uber last year, they pretty much have gotten out of their robotics business. And it wouldn't surprise me if Lyft eventually got to the same conclusion. They seem to be just on this like thin layer of being an airline for a lot of these parts of on-demand life, which is perfectly fine. It might be great. So I think, to answer your question, a lot of the value is going to roll up to somebody who can combine a little bit of the service experience as well as the manufacturing. And right now, and probably for the next 15 years, there aren't that many companies that are willing to stick it out to spend 10 figures, 11 figures to bring these ideas to market. Like you have Google and Baidu and Ford, VW, and there's not many. How many of them are going to be able to like stick through it through multiple CEO changes and board of directors changes a decade from now? Probably an incredibly small number. I guess in that description of what I gave you is probably like how you would design the Tesla point of view on autonomy, right? Which is, look, we have built the vehicle. We'll put this thin layer of service on top of it, which is you can access the car. And so I'm not necessarily optimistic that Tesla will be able to meet any of its public sort of promises around timelines for their system. But I do think that is probably the most compelling vision of it right now, even if it might take another 10 years.
Cool.
Sure.
Next one is, what kind of ancillary services do you have your eye on as autonomous vehicles become a closer reality?
The commitments that these companies have made to zero emission, I think you won't be able to operate a TNC or a ride-hailing business without an electric vehicle by 2030. So some of them have said that. I think if you read between the lines, probably they will allow those vehicles to be hybrids. But in a lot of the big cities, it will be zero emission battery electric vehicles only. And so therefore, one of the ancillary things is just going to be their own charging network. So how will they support the electric vehicles is a really interesting thing that I actually think that a lot of the TNCs are going to have their own charging network, or if they're not their own, they're going to have almost like reservations within existing networks so that they can guarantee their drivers can use stuff pretty frequently. Because it's interesting, if you look at the age of a lot of the Lyft and Uber vehicles, a lot of them today are somewhere between 5 and 10 years old. And so if you were to say, if I have to run an EV in San Francisco, if I drive for Lyft in 2030, it means that vehicle is getting built and sold like in the next year or two. So it's like a Chevy Bolt or maybe a used Model 3 or something like that. So the vehicles are right here, right now. They have a 250 mile, 300 mile range. They're going to need a lot of charging infrastructure help. That's one thing. The other thing is, I don't think that these ride hailing companies and therefore the autonomous vehicle companies have really done as much around kind of education and communicating the benefits of these systems, to be honest. Like when most people now think of autonomous vehicles, I think they think of the Uber crash and the fatality and the way that these companies have been run by people who don't necessarily think about safety. And I would take the opposite tact, which is if I was running an AV business, I would go into a city and say, I'm going to fund the creation of bike lanes and wider sidewalks. And I'm going to be the ultimate advocate for pedestrian safety. And when I do that at no small cost to me, I want to have the exclusive permit to operate AVs in this geo for the next 2 years and actually incentivize these safety creating things in cities. So not necessarily like a service, but I think it's a big opportunity around AVs that some of these companies are going to have to do.
Let's do one more question. I think actually combining the next two popular questions, in my mind, they go together and actually builds, I think, on this point. So one question is, how do you think about the thorny ethical dilemma surrounding AI algorithms for autonomous vehicles? And the other is, what are the key safety concerns that are preventing us from widespread level 5 autonomous vehicles? There's, I think, some connection. There's also some different aspects, of course, but you can probably answer them.
Sure.
Combined.
Sure. Thanks both for your questions. On the first one, I will say most creators of these systems don't actually have a really good answer for you when you ask them, how do you know your system is safe enough to deploy? Which I think is actually much more important of a question to ask them is, does the engineering team feel it's ready? And so there's like a philosophy around how you actually understand as a company what's safe. There's a standard called UL 4600 that might be interesting for you all to check out. And it's basically the first time UL has done any sort of like framework around safety for automated systems. A lot of it applies specifically to vehicles, but you could actually use it for a lot of other automated systems, and it's worth thinking about. And where my answer to this is, I actually don't believe that understanding the safety case for these rollouts is really well defined by current regulations at the state level and certainly at the federal level, where there's almost little to say about automated vehicles today. And so the first step, I think, in getting comfortable with how these systems actually work from an ethical perspective is understanding how the people who have released them have defined safety. And I don't think that there's necessarily like one dogma around this, but I actually don't know if people have ever really talked about this. The same way you might think about understanding how somebody like song exploder style, like how you made a song. There's not a really good set of experiences that I have had with people who are the product managers of these programs who have talked about their safety case. So that's one thing. And maybe part of this is just we don't have a lot of understanding at the policy level of what automotive safety in systems really means. Unfortunately, in the United States, there's been more law at the state level than at the federal level. I think that's probably going to change. Startups have benefited from that, by the way, because if you're an autonomous vehicle startup, there's a state you could have found in the last couple of years that would have allowed you to run a vehicle on the road. And so for you as a startup trying to make your way in the world, that might have been a good thing. What is it the right sort of ethical framework to think about these, like how we're rolling out autonomous vehicles? Absolutely not. I'm punting a little bit on your question, Michelle, just because I think that is like the fundamental perspective on this that I haven't heard yet. And then when it comes to the second question, this is something I hear a lot, which is, oh yeah, everything's ready. Just we need the attorneys to sign off on it. And I think it's underselling, frankly, like how much work is yet to be done. And there's this interesting thing happening with the SAE levels right now. So if you look at the SAE created these 6 levels of automation, And there's about to be a seventh, which is that there's a level 2.5 or 2 plus. And what it essentially says is this is like a level 3 system in the sense that the vehicle is taking over both the latitudinal and longitudinal control, but the human is still responsible for what that vehicle does. And if it leapt into this next phase, which is the vehicle or the manufacturer responsible for it, that would be a level 3, and by some people's definition. And I think this is a really like a problematic phase for how these vehicles are being developed. And I have talked to many people at car companies who they know that their systems aren't ready. And I think the moment at which a lot of car companies or a lot of manufacturers of these systems say, not only is it ready, but we'll take the full legal responsibility for it, that's actually when you know the engineering team has been done, is complete. So it's like a big tell in my mind. But thank you for your question.
Yeah, thank you, Reilly, for all your, at least for me, very wonderful insights. Maybe one more plenary tip: if the students do one or two things at Stanford, if they're interested in this space, what should they do? What do you think they should do? Or maybe something.
I mean, yeah, what a amazing place to be to do this stuff, because there's actually a lot of transportation entrepreneurship at Stanford. One insight would be, I think that you have the opportunity to work for a really interesting company without going too far. Certainly all the car companies and people try to recruit all of you guys, but you could work for a ride hailing company or something like that, which would be really fascinating. I do think there are so many different layers of transportation. Think of it like the Taco Bell 7-layer burrito. Within any component that we're talking about, logistics, ride hailing, there's an opportunity for you to be an expert in one of those areas that where you might be passionate about. And I know for a fact that there's just not enough people in all these other emerging parts of the ecosystem, whether it's hydrogen for long haul stuff or it's charging. A lot of people have gone into ride hailing and robotaxi over the last 5 years as almost like robotaxi generalists. And I would challenge you to just be a javelin thrower, be a very specific like application of your passion and your resources. And you will get noticed easier if you do that. And also, I think you'll find some really cool opportunities.